All right, good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock, so we're going to go on ahead and get started this morning. I'm Andrew Gifford. I'm from the admissions department, and I'm here to introduce one of my all-time favorite speakers, Dr. Parker. Dr. Parker has been teaching students at this school for about 20 years now. And just a few little fun facts about him. He is the self-proclaimed #1 Duck Dynasty fan of all time. He has the t-shirt and the DVD of the whole first season that he watches regularly. He's just a big fan of all those things. He loves a good practical joke. He's seen a few in his lifetime, and there's nothing he loves more than a well-placed hamburger. I have to ask him about that later. I joke around a lot, and I could stand up here and tell you about all the degrees he has. I could stand up here and tell you about how smart he is, but I think the most important things that I can say about him are that he loves the Lord and he loves his students. And I think that is evidenced by the fact that a bunch of us are in the room this morning. A bunch of the people who took his classes, we're back here to come and hear him talk because we spent a lot of time, and I mean, we loved him as a teacher, loved him as a faculty member here, but more importantly, and I think this is the best honor I can give him, he was not just a teacher, but he was a mentor, and I'm happy to call him a friend, and so I'm very excited to have him come speak to us this morning.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'll get you that $20 bill later as we agree. All right, today we're going to be looking at the original sources for studying Islam. Now, this is not going to be a lecture on the history of Islam, the history of Muhammad, apologetics, and anti-Muslim apologetics, or whatever. This is really a lecture intended to give you some tools so that you can begin to explore these texts and use them in conversation with Muslims, perhaps, or maybe just understand them for your own purposes. So let's go ahead and get into this. I want to apologize for the slide presentation in advance. I tried to come by and troubleshoot last night in this room, and there was a class in here, so I got here early this morning, and guess what? There was another class in here. So I found out just a few moments ago that this is the worst possible background, even though it looks great on my computer, the worst possible background for this presentation, so I hope you'll be able to kind of hang with me today. All right, so I want to start off with an open letter sent to the youth of the West, kids in Europe and in America, by the Ayatollah in Iran. This was back in 2015, and part of the letter says this: I don't insist that you accept my reading or any other reading of Islam. What I want to say is, don't allow this dynamic and effective reality in today's world to be introduced to you through resentments and prejudices. Don't allow them to hypocritically introduce their own recruited terrorists as representatives of Islam. Receive knowledge of Islam from its primary and original sources. Gain information about Islam through the Quran and the life of its great prophet. I would like to ask you whether you've directly read the Quran of the Muslims. Have you studied the teachings of the Prophet of Islam and his humane ethical doctrines? Have you ever received the message of Islam from any sources other than the media? So I'm going to ask y'all, how many of you have read the Quran kiver to kiver? Got 1, 2, 3.
We've read part of it.
Okay, part of it. Fantastic. Another one back here, 4. Okay. What I'm going to try to encourage you to do is to read the Quran. Okay, you might. Why do I want to read the Quran? Let's have a look at maybe some justification for that. Okay. Let me just ask, in addition to the Quran, have any of you read the Ahadith? I didn't think so. Okay. How about biographies of Muhammad? Oh, we got one down here. Okay, fantastic. So what we're going to do today is look at how you might begin to do this. What are some of the obstacles? What are some of the resources you might have available to help you engage this material? And as for reasons why you might want to read this material, one, it will help you understand one of the major world religions. That's always a good thing. We have world religions classes here at Faulkner, teaching a wide variety of things, Islam being one of the major components of that course. Also, reading this material will help you understand world events, terrorism, Middle East, but maybe more importantly, it'll help you understand and interact with the Muslims in your world today. I have a Muslim on my street, right next door to me. She is, I think, from Nigeria. I have a Muslim 2 doors down from me on my street. He's from Pakistan. So, thinking through my world, I know I have, well, I don't have because I don't teach undergraduates anymore. Some of the teachers here have Muslims in their classes. There's some here at Faulkner. I even saw one at Dairy Queen the other day. So we're likely to encounter people in our world around us, and it's good to know something about their religion, how they think, how their worldview is shaped. And these books will help you to understand that. So let's start with the Quran itself. Okay, what are some obstacles to understanding the Quran? I think the first one is it is just not easy for a Westerner to understand. I don't know if any of y'all, but let me see a show of hands of those of you who have read the Quran or portions of the Quran. How many of you found it easy sledding?
No.
Okay, there we go. Same thing with me. The first time I read it, having a biblical background, I could understand some of the allusions. I could pick out some of the words, get a vague idea of what was going on in the passage. But if you pushed me to say, what was this about? Even with a relatively short passage, a lot of times I would totally be in the dark. So, as you can see here by this quote by another Western figure, he also found this in a very, very difficult text to work through. Nothing but a sense of beauty could carry any European through the Quran. I don't know if it's all that bad, but it shows you at least some people have difficulty, right? Okay, so if you go to the store, buy a Quran and start reading, good luck to you. Okay, you might want some pointers on how to approach it. Okay, another thing odd about the Quran is it is entirely in direct address. It's God speaking the entire time through the book. So you're not going to have this nice story. You're going to have a story about the creation of the world, but where it appears in the text will not be at the beginning, and you may see it several different times, but it is not going to be a straightforward story. Now, I guess you could say maybe our Bible didn't have to be, because our Bible is composed of many books and they could have been organized in lots of different fashions. But the way most people do it, in terms of canon, is we start with Genesis and kind of work basically in historical order until you run out of history, and then you plug in some other things like poetry and the prophets. And then in the New Testament, you have the Gospels, Acts, and then we kind of cap it off with the book of Revelation. So there is some sort of a historical framework for the way that our Bibles are designed now. Not so with the Quran. So that's going to be a difficulty for you. Also, you may be a little bit puzzled by the use of we when God speaks. God is going to say, we say such and such, or our such and such. This is not an endorsement of the Trinitarian idea that Christians normally believe. This is instead a plural of majesty. Allah is great and powerful, so it's put in he speaks of himself in the plural, kind of like the Queen of England might, we are not amused, when there's really only one person in the room. Okay, so it's that kind of idea. Okay? We've already talked a little bit about arrangement, but this is maybe a different issue. The Quran is going to be organized after the first surah. It's going to be organized by diminishing length. So in other words, Surah 2 is the longest, and then they will get shorter as you go through the Quran. But there is another arrangement. The Quran can be arranged chronologically. Some Muslims do this, but it's a little bit debatable sometimes which ones are in this, the precise historical order, but you can kind of get a vague idea of chronology. And that's another way to read it as well. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. I just wanted to raise the issue now. And then finally, there are a lot of different English translations of the Quran that you can choose from. Now, I'm assuming nobody reads Arabic? Okay. So it's kind of interesting. Most people, when they want to get a Quran, they want one with English and Arabic. And they will complain if you don't use one that has English and Arabic, yet they listen to a preacher who probably doesn't really know Greek every Sunday, and they themselves don't know it, but they might want to have a Greek text in front of them. It's really interesting how we're not really all that concerned about the issue when it's our religion, But we're really concerned about it when somebody else is. We want to make sure we have that Arabic text right next to the English one. I would say, if you don't read Arabic, don't worry about having Arabic in your book. Let the editor fill the content, fill it up with other content. Okay. So I'm going to promote, and I don't get a kickback for this, although I probably should. I'm going to promote the Study Quran, which is pictured here in the middle for any of you who are interested in starting this study. There are two others to the side. You have one by Assad, one by Ali. But I want to compare these three versions very quickly. And if you want to look at them, I have Ali's up here, and I also have the Study Quran. You can peruse these after class if you so desire. But here are some of the things maybe to think about in purchasing. We do this when we purchase Bibles. So here we go with the Quran. The versions of Assad and Ali are translated by an individual. Most of us, when we choose a Bible, want a committee translation. There are some by Brother Hugo McCord and others, individuals who have translated the New Testament perhaps. But I think probably for most of us, we're going to use a Bible that has a team of translators. The Study Quran is the only one of these three that has a team of translators. We've already talked about the Arabic English thing. The Study Quran doesn't have Arabic in it at all. It's about the same size as some of these other texts, but the leftover space is used quite well for other things. So we'll talk about those. Well, we're actually talking about it here. With each of the surahs, each of the chapters of the Quran, the Study Quran gives the best introduction to the chapter. What is it about? What's going to happen in this chapter? What should you look for? The others will have a brief introduction, but there's not a whole lot to speak of. In terms of notes, there are two things to think of. Assad and Ali give their particular perspective of the Quran in their notes. They also don't give too many notes. In the Study Quran, you get multiple Islamic interpretations, various schools of thought. You'll get Sunni, Shia, Sufi interpretations, comprehensive notes, and where something is debatable in the Islamic community, they will say, this group believes this group believes this group believes this. The consensus seems to be this. Boy, that's really helpful, because if you're just reading the Quran and you don't even know what the issue is, there's no way you're going to be able to make much sense of it coming at it from a non-Muslim background. And in terms of essays, the Study Quran has 15 very detailed scholarly articles. The Quran and afterlife, the Quran and violence, the Quran and women, the Quran and this or that. 15 really good essays, a lot of maps, timelines. It is the premier study Quran. If you want the best one, in my opinion, this is it. Now, a lot of Muslims do not like it. Reason being, it gives multiple perspectives, because only their school of thought, whoever they are, is the correct one. So a lot of times there's a kickback, when you promote something like this. But it is an excellent resource, I think. A couple of things that might help you with the Quran in addition to it. This book, by closest to me, Introducing the Quran for Today's Reader, was written by a Westerner, John Faulkner. I went to school with him. He's probably one of the few geniuses I've ever met in my life. He did speak Arabic. His theological background is Roman Catholic, but I don't think he really believes much in it, because he denies one of the premier elements of the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So not sure how far his religious convictions go with Catholicism or Christianity, but he does know a lot about Islamic culture. He knows a lot about the Arabic and the text of the Quran. So coming at the book from a Western perspective, which I assume most of you are, an excellent book. He is very generous to Islam. He tries to go out of his way not to offend, and to be very careful in his exegesis, and even deals with a lot of modern issues like feminism in the Quran, how women are treated, and modern feminist movements in Islamic societies related to that. The next book does not go out of its way to protect Islamic sensibilities. It is The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran by Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer has been vilified by several groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they try to block him on the internet. He runs a website called Jihad Watch, but it is, in my estimation, one of the best gauges of what's going on in the world today in the Islamic community. Sometimes he gives kudos to Islamic groups, but mostly he's watching terrorist activity, things that people say, so if you're interested in the Islamic events in the Islamic world, whether you like him or not, he's the one who's going to be on top of everything. This book will also deal comprehensively with the contents of the Quran, but it will say some things that Faulkner will not say. Okay, so you're getting two extremes. Somebody who's very favorable towards Islam, somebody who is not anti-Islam, but he's anti-extremist. Okay, between the two, you get some truth. I do this when I read a commentary. I'll get one that's extremely conservative, one that's extremely liberal, and I'll read them both. I just want to see what people say and what the opinions are. And it's interesting, a lot of times between the two, you can find most of the details that are pertinent. The third item is the 2-hour Quran. It's not really going to teach you anything about the Quran, but it is going to place it in chronological order and make it into a storyline that you can understand. So if you have 2 hours and you just want to understand the Quran, this will give you the elements of the story, the elements of what's going on. It's an excellent tool. Bill Warner is also known for his political Islam website. He is largely anti-Islam. The book, I don't think, will reflect that. Maybe the front matter might, but the book itself is just the Quran. So I think that's a good tool to also use to just kind of speed up the process. Okay, so let's talk about the principle of abrogation in the Quran. The surahs in the Quran can be placed in chronological order. Some of them happen when Muhammad is in Mecca. Then he will eventually move to Medina. And they change. Certain things that were said earlier will be negated or undone by later statements. And this is a common principle in the Quran. There are at least 4 places where Allah says, I may bring a second word that's better than the first. And we see this in Christianity and in Judaism as well. The idea of abrogation. The people of God were once required to be circumcised. Now that is treated in a different way in the New Testament. Used to do animal sacrifice. Now Jesus is the sacrifice. There used to be a temple. Now the church or the individual plays the role of the temple. Or maybe there are some instances in which something's totally done away with. Something was done in the Old Testament was not done in the New Testament. It's the same principle in Islam. So in this chart, just as an example here, the items in the center column are where a statement was made, and then later the statement is undone. It's replaced by another statement. For example, originally the Muslims prayed toward Jerusalem, and then they received a word, and then they prayed toward Mecca. They used to pray on the Day of Atonement, then they prayed on Ramadan. These things are abrogated, they are negated, they are replaced by another commandment of God or statement of God. So when you're reading the Quran, and I hope you can see this, I'm sorry about the tiny, tiny font. It looked bigger when I did it, but I don't know what happened to it. But we're reading chronologically. We're going to read Surah 2, Surah 9, and then Surah 109. We're reading chronologically through the Quran, we think, but we're really not. The first statement is frequently quoted by social justice warriors. There is no compulsion in religion, okay? In other words, you don't have to become a Muslim, okay? So it looks very pacific, okay? Then you come to the second statement, which is in chapter 9. This is the sword passage, where it says, commands Muslims to fight against those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture, that is Christians and Jews. You're to fight them until they give the tax. So Christians and Jews are kind of like in a protected, have a protected status in Islam. If you pay the tax, they won't kill you, okay? So you have to pay the tax while being humbled, okay? That sounds kind of harsh, But it's good. It's good because we continue reading. And then Muhammad finally says to some people, you have your religion, I have my religion. We're all good. You can do your thing, I'll do my thing, no problem. But in reality, none of those passages mean, well, the middle one does, but the ones to either end don't mean what I just said. So first of all, if you excerpt a passage, if you proof text a passage, you may end up getting the wrong interpretation. Second of all, these are not in chronological order. The first one is actually the last one. The first one is where Muhammad has no political power at all. He's being persecuted, and he's trying to convince his tribe to come over. And his tribe says, let's mingle the gods, our pagan gods, with what you're teaching, Muhammad. He goes, no, you do what you do, I'll do what I do. It is not saying, I'm okay with you doing what you do. He's basically saying, you keep doing what you're doing, God will fix you in the end. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, okay? Our second passage is actually the top one, in which it is not saying there's no compulsion in religion. You don't have to become a Muslim. It's saying you don't have to become a Muslim if you're a Christian or a Jew, but you do have to pay a tax. It's not saying you don't have to become, you don't have some kind of a penalty at all. And then the last passage, it may be the Great Commission of Muhammad. It's either the last or the next to last thing he said, which is to fight. Okay, so a lot of groups like ISIS will take that one and really hammer it and push it. Of course, not all Muslims understand it that way, but that's it is actually the three statements are actually pretty consistent. None of them are saying it's okay. You can just go wherever you want to go religiously, and we Muslims are fine with you. Actually, they're not fine. You either need to convert or be killed or pay the tax, ultimately. Okay, so it's very interesting seeing how it plays out. Now, again, not all modern Muslims understand these this way, but this is it seems to be the original intent of the passages. Okay, so now we're going to move beyond the Quran. We're going to move to the Ahadith. The Ahadith or constitute another collection of material that are passed down from person to person. So you see over on the far side we have the Prophet Muhammad. He delivers a statement. This guy memorizes it, passes it to his Muhammad's wife, and then it gets passed down and even maybe goes into two different chains of tradition. So it's not a real complicated idea to understand, but the Hadith is a saying or an action or a habit of Muhammad that has passed down from person to person to person to person and then finally been captured in print. Okay? So it's oral tradition and finally it will be written down. So your hadith, an individual hadith, a hadith is the plural, hadith is the singular. A hadith will have two parts. It'll have the narrative, basically whatever the story is about the prophet, whatever it is he said. And then you will have the chain of tradition. And that's the isnad that we see here. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So ahadith are collections of lots of different sayings that Muhammad delivered, lots of different things that he did. And the question is, why do ahadith matter? I mean, the Quran's the Bible of the Muslims, right? We don't need ahadith. Actually, you do. They're exceedingly important for worship. Muslims are not sola scriptura when it comes to the Quran. We say Bible alone. They don't say Quran alone. Now, there's one group that does, but they're kind of regarded as a fringe group. They're kind of regarded as heretics by people who don't endorse this mentality. So there is something else that goes with the Quran. The ahadith supported the Quranic sayings and traditions. In other words, when you look at the Quran, a lot of times you just have like a little statement, a little blurb, a little quote of Muhammad. You go read the hadith and it'll say, and this was delivered in this context, and then you've got like 4 paragraphs. So it gives the background. It tells you where the Quranic passage came from, why it was supposedly delivered. So one example of how this impacts Islamic worship, the Quran says to pray 3 times a day. The Hadith says 5 times a day. And Muslims pray 5 times a day. Not based on the Quran, based on a Hadith. Okay? So they are necessary to explain certain practices of worship. They're also important for imitation of Muhammad. Muhammad is the perfect man, according to Muslims. Whatever he said, whatever he did, you should try to imitate as a Muslim man. So this presents a bit of a problem because the Quran doesn't say much about Muhammad. It only mentions him 4 times by name. If you were forced to create a biography of Muhammad from the Quran, you would have a really hard time doing it. So we go to the Ahadith, and we find out some characteristics of Muhammad. He wore a beard with the mustache shaved out, kind of like the brother Jedediah beard, kind of an Amish-looking beard. Okay, dyed their beards with henna. You can see this elderly man has shaved his mustache. His beard is red. Maybe I should try that because my beard is gray, but I'm probably not going to go for that. They don't wear pants below the ankle. Why? Because Muhammad, these are the practices of Muhammad recorded in this material. Okay, so we have several collections of ahadith, and they're actually quite large. I mean, those of you who are familiar with Judaism, we're familiar with Mishnah and Talmud. This is kind of the equivalent of that sort of material in size and content. So when you're looking at ahadith, you may be talking about washing, you may be ritual purity, you may be talking about human sexuality, you may be talking about animals, you may be talking about different sacrifices or holidays, you may be talking about jihad. Okay, lots of things will be included in these texts, things that Muhammad said. We have a Sunni collection and a Shia collection. I'm going to focus on the Sunni collection because you're most likely to meet a Sunni Muslim. And I'm not going to go through all the details of this. I'm going to kind of slide by it. But this is why I myself would focus on the Sunni collection. 84 to 90% of your Muslims are going to be Sunni. The green areas on this map, the light green areas, if you can distinguish them, are Sunni populations, and Shia populations are somewhere between 10 to 16% of the Muslim population, and they are the dark green areas. So you can see here in places like the lower Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Yemen, you can see those populations there, and you may actually meet a Shia here in the States. I mean, they are definitely here, but you're more likely, probably percentage-wise, to be a Sunni. So we're going to talk about Sunni traditions in just a second. We've already kind of dealt with the chain of tradition. I could probably just zap through this, but what Muslims are trying to do with Muhammad's traditions is they're trying to weed out false traditions. There were thousands of these that used to exist. For example, the main guy who started the process was al-Bukhari. He had about 100,000 traditions about Muhammad. And out of those 100,000, he kept a little bit over 7,000. He found a way to whittle it down and go, okay, these are probably more authentic. And I think he actually did a really good job. Kudos to him for working with this material and sorting it out. But you can see that the categories are authentic, good, weak, and forged or fabricated, false traditions. And I'll try to make this painless. Have I made it painless so far? Probably not. With authentic traditions, basically everybody in the line of tradition, all the people who passed on the tradition, need to be reliable folk. They need to have good memories. There don't need to be any chronological discrepancies. If you say that, I received this, I, Floyd Parker, received this tradition from George Washington, President of the United States. Well, something's wrong there. Okay, so if there's some sort of an anachronism, you pitch it out. But if it meets those criteria, it's good, and you want to keep it. It's an authentic tradition. I shouldn't have used the word good because that's actually what another category is called. It's authentic. It's sahih. Okay. If you want to read these, you can get them in hard copies or hardback versions, or you can buy this $3 searchable version. That's what I would recommend, because if you buy this in book form, it's going to cost you hundreds of dollars. It's going to take up a lot of shelf space. But this $3 version is searchable. It's amazing. I'll show you an example of it in just a second. And it contains both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which are these are the top collections every Sunni Muslim is going to, if it's in there, they pretty much got to accept it. It's very counted very good. It's sahih. The statements in it are all authentic from their perspective. So I would encourage you to right now go on Amazon, $3. Buy this. And, I'm not getting anything from it again, but maybe I should. Maybe I should sell these. This is what it will look like. You'll have an Arabic text. So see, you can get the Arabic text with this instead of getting it with your Quran. And then you'll feel good, right? You can press your friends. But this is how it kind of works. We have a statement from the Quran, and you may not always have one, but this is from the Quran. If there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women. Okay, this is talking about witnesses in a particular type of transaction. Okay, so obviously a man is more significant than a woman as a witness in court. Okay, and in the passage right below it, we have an interpretation passed on by this person. The prophet says, "Isn't the witness of a woman equal to half that of a man?" The women said yes. He said, "This is because of the deficiency in the woman's mind." But, ladies, now be careful, because that's only one. Some Muslims actually take this universally: women are deficient. But the good news is, other schools of thought think they're only deficient in financial transactions. So it's okay. It's okay. Anyway. We have another category, which is a good category. It's where maybe one of the narrators is a little bit questionable, maybe in his mental capacity or his ability to, maybe there's a little bit of a glitch in the tradition, but for the most part, it looks like it's intact. Maybe it can be checked by a parallel line of tradition that is authentic, and it can be deemed good. Okay, and then we also have weak traditions. So let me illustrate it here with this little diagram. Hopefully you can see this. Here is the wife of Muhammad, Aisha. Okay, a good tradition, an authentic tradition, will be represented by most of these lines over on the right-hand side. So something comes from her, from the prophet, passes down a line of tradition, and finally comes down to Al-Bukhari, and he records it. But if you'll notice on this side, we have maybe a good tradition. There's maybe this guy in red right here. If you're not colorblind, you can see he's red, or if you can, sorry, it's so dim in here. But this guy maybe is a little questionable, but for the most part, it looks like we've got reliable transmitters. And you can also back it up with this second line of tradition. So this is probably a good tradition. But a weak tradition would be the third one from the left, where you have this same tradition recorded, but when you go back up the chain, there's a gap between the earliest narrator and Aisha. There's something wrong here. You can't trace it back to her directly. So this would be a weak tradition within Islamic culture. And then sometimes you just have false ones. People even admitted sometimes that you should make them up. And apparently, if you have 100,000 of them floating around, somebody made some of them up. And Al-Bukhari and others were pretty good at weeding them out. In fact, the next one, which I won't read to you, is where some Jews said, "Hey, Muhammad gave us an exemption from the tax. See, here's a document signed by 2 of his men. One of the men actually died before the document could have been signed, and one of them became a Muslim several years after the document would have been signed, and they were able to show that this one was false." So, I mean, it's common sense. It's actually pretty clever if you think about it. Another one that you hear a lot by scholars, I hear this one, in fact, John Faulkner fell victim to this in his book. "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. We have returned from the lesser jihad, fighting people, to the greater jihad of struggling against our own flesh and against our, the forces of evil in our community or within ourselves." You hear this a lot on television. You see it a lot in books. Muslims quote it, non-Muslims quote it. And basically what it is to show is jihad is not really holy war. The important thing about jihad is the internal struggle. Well, that may be true, because jihad has a very wide semantic range. But as far as that actual quote coming from Muhammad, it doesn't appear in any of the collections. In fact, this guy here at the bottom, who is instructor of our dear brother Osama bin Laden, says that this, nobody knows where this came from, and it's not authentic. We should fight. Okay, so And there are other more moderate folk that would agree with him. How am I doing on time here? I don't want to totally run out. Okay. So there are lots of reasons why fabrications could happen. You could have political differences, or you might have some heretics that want to inject something. Somebody may just have a good tale they want to spin and say, hey, Muhammad said this. But for the most part, Bukhari and others weeded these out. So I think they actually did a good job of getting about as close as you can to the historical Muhammad within reason. Okay, so a couple of things that may be of interest in the ahadith, and this is where I want to be careful. I don't want to be unkind in this section. But these are some things that you might be interested in. I think at least we need to pay them some attention. One of the chief doctrines of Islam, not actually written down, but this just almost everybody seems to endorse it, is the Quran's text has never, ever, ever changed. When it was delivered, it has stayed the same. The Bible has not stayed the same. It has textual variation. Therefore, our book is correct, your book is wrong. Actually, the discovery of several texts in a mosque in Yemen have demonstrated that there are multiple textual variants, conclusively demonstrated there were multiple textual variants in the Quran early on. But there are other texts that also indicate that, and here we have a couple. Now, this is kind of a weird tale. I don't know if I probably shouldn't have used this one. These are all going to be delicate, so y'all are adults, I hope. If there are any children in the room, you might want to leave now. But in Islamic culture, for a man to be with a woman is inappropriate if he's not a relative. So the way you make him a relative is you take an adult man and you breastfeed him. And then he's a relative, and it's safe for him to be with the woman without being sexually attracted. Now, to me, that's mind-boggling, because that would probably have that effect on me. But in some cultures, that's how it is. Okay, that's what this text is about. The verse of stoning and breastfeeding an adult 10 times was revealed, and the paper was with me under my pillow, says the wife of Muhammad. When the messenger of Allah died, we were preoccupied with his death, and a tame sheep came in and ate it. We lost a passage of the Quran. This sheep was hungering for the word and apparently got it. Okay. We also have a similar report where Aisha talks about, it's the same kind of, the word suckling there is talking about the same thing we just talked about, so I'm not going to describe it again. But it's basically a text about this that used to be known and recited that has disappeared. It didn't make it in the actual Quran. Interesting. There are numerous examples of this in ahadith, it basically conceding we lost some passages or there are discrepancies between what this guy says and what this guy says. Okay. The stoning for adultery passage, not in the Quran. It's actually in the ahadith. And it's followed as if it's in the Quran, but it's not in the Quran. Now we move to something that's extremely delicate and likely to get me probably beheaded. I'm going to try to be careful with what I say. I want to be respectful. I just lost my little control here. It got beheaded. But talking about Muhammad and Aisha, a lot of people are often disrespectful when they talk about Muhammad's marriage to this very young girl. She was 6 years old when he married her. He consummated the marriage when she was 9, at which time he was 52 years old. Any fathers or daughters? Yeah. I'm 54. If you have a 6-year-old daughter, you're going to let me marry your 6-year-old daughter? In a Western culture, it's very, that would certainly be unusual. Apparently, it's even unusual in Islamic culture, according to some people, but it's still, this is followed sometimes because Muhammad did it. But the way that it's usually explained is, maybe the traditions are incorrect about her age. Maybe she was actually, in her teens when this happened, okay? Or maybe she matured earlier. Maybe girls back then matured earlier than they do now. Or maybe she herself matured earlier. What would be a requirement is she would have to have entered into puberty and had to have been able to give consent to be married. It's possible, I guess, but I find it, maybe difficult to swallow. One of the things, these are two passages. Notice both of these are from authoritative texts. We have Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari. So these are beyond question. They talk about her age and that this actually happened. So as far as saying, well, the traditions are wrong, you got to go head to head with these two accepted traditions. By saying she was mature, I'm not sure dolls are a universal sign of maturity. Maybe that doesn't have anything to do with puberty. I guess there are grown women that still play with dolls, probably collect dolls, I imagine. But you can see where the problem is, and this is a difficult text. But this is in the Hadith. You can read about it in these two authoritative texts. The Quran talks several times about women, those whom your right hand possesses. In this book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi, a Muslim who converted to Christianity, some version of Christianity from Islam, he says that these were the verses that broke his back. These are the ones that caused him to really question Islam and move in the direction of Christianity. I will tell you, I will warn you, don't lead with this if you're talking to a Muslim. You want to develop a relationship and begin to gently question. But these for him, were the deciding factor. Basically, the purple passage there about those whom your right hand possesses was delivered in the context of a battle. A battle takes place, the Muslims capture a group of women, and they want to have relations with them. And Muhammad says, well, Muhammad doesn't say, Allah says, you can only have a relationship with your wives and with those whom your right hand possesses. So go ahead. Captured war slaves, women who were captured, they're allowed to have relations with. Now, on the next entry here, this is an instance where the guys capture women. They want to ransom them, but they want to know, and I'm sorry, this is delicate, they want to know if they can have sex using a primitive form of birth control, so they don't get the women pregnant, so they can resell them. They won't be damaged merchandise. And Muhammad receives a statement, and basically, when they ask Muhammad, they said, what do you think about it? He goes, Allah's already determined who's going to be born and who's not going to be born. It's not going to make any difference if you use this form of primitive birth control. Go ahead and have relations with them. Let Allah sort it out. Okay, those are the ones that led Nabil Qureshi to really begin to question Islam and to move in another direction. And if you think, about that, this was a savage time. Did people rape in war? Sure they did. Did Westerners rape in war? Sure they did. Is there direct evidence in the New Testament, for example, to allow crusaders to do this? No, there's not. But there actually is in these texts. And if you look at it, I'm not saying all Muslims do this. Don't misunderstand me. Many of them have probably never read these texts, just like you've probably never read your Bible. Okay, they probably don't know they're there. But some groups like ISIS, when they take sex slaves, this is the justification for doing so, and it's Sunni Muslim. Okay, so it's an authoritative behavior if they want to do it. At least you can make that case. You can proof text it. Okay, real quickly, biographies of Muhammad. I have like a whole minute here. These are interesting to me because these are some of the earliest resources we have about Muhammad. They paint a picture of a very savage warlord who commits genocide, assassinates people, does all kinds of horrendous things. And surprisingly, they're written by a faithful Muslim. Now, they're usually disregarded. Why? Because the authors of these texts are before the time when the criteria for weeding out tradition existed. So they don't always give their sources. They don't give their isnad, their chain of tradition. So a lot of times these guys are disregarded. But you can get this book, The Life of Muhammad by Guillaume. You can get it online. I don't know if it's legal to get it. I mean, you can get it at this site right here. I don't know if it's legal to, copyright-wise, but it is out there. But I actually bought a hard copy of it. There's a picture of it there on the side. I find these incredibly interesting because they're 200 years earlier than what Bukhari's doing. So it is a picture of Muhammad. Most Muslims disregard it. But what's interesting is Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, both of those texts hold him in high regard. Both of the authoritative texts hold him in high regard, but most modern Muslims disregard him altogether. So very quickly, we started out with a challenge to read the original sources, and this is what the original Protestant Reformation was about. Go back to the sources. Well, Islamic folk, some, especially radical groups, are actually taking this challenge. They're going back to these original sources and reading them outside of schools of thought that used to kind of model, take care of the violent element. Now, a lot of the schools, the traditional schools of Islam, don't emphasize the violent side. But when you go back to the original sources and don't have some sort of guidance, you can very quickly fall into a very violent strain of Islam. So I think it's important for us to know about that these books, for that reason and for others. So I hope you'll take the challenge to read the Quran, but even more so, hope you'll read your Bible. All right, thank y'all.